The morning I am going to tell you about, I was standing on the porch of a small cabin in the Cascades foothills, with a rabbit pressed warm against my left boot, and I was watching something step back into the tree line that I have no good word for. It was first light. The frost had laid itself across the railing and across the enamel dish sitting there, and the dish held two pieces of smoothed cedar bark that had not been there when I went to bed. One I had placed, one I had not. I stood very still, and the thing at the tree line stood very still, and for a moment the whole morning held its breath. I want to be careful about what I say happened next, because I have been careful about it ever since. To understand what I was doing on that porch, I need to go back to the week before and then further back than that. Carol died on the 14th of February. I know how that sounds. I know the date is the kind of detail that makes people wince when you say it out loud, and I have stopped saying it out loud to most people because the wince is not something I know what to do with. She had been sick for a long time before that, and I had been her primary care at home for the last 14 months, and when it was over, I did not know what to do with my hands. That is the most accurate way I know to say it. My hands had been busy for 14 months, and then they were not, and I walked around our house in Ridgewood for several weeks, picking up objects and setting them down again without any clear purpose. The kettle, the good scissors from the kitchen drawer, a jar of the blackberry preserves she had put up the previous summer and never opened. I'm not a man who joins things. I want to be honest about that up front. I had spent 31 years as a lineman for the county utility, and I was comfortable with the kind of work that went up in the air and came down finished, with clear tolerances. I was less comfortable with anything that asked me to sit in a circle and share. So when my neighbour Phyllis mentioned the wildlife rehabilitation program in late September, I almost told her no before she finished the sentence. They run a cabin rotation, she said. Short stints, 4 days at a stretch. You do feeding schedules, you observe, you keep records. It is mostly solitary work. I heard the word solitary and I signed the intake form the following Tuesday. The program was coordinated out of a county extension office about 40 minutes south, and a woman named Donna Marsh ran it. Donna had a voice that sounded like she had been explaining sensible things to people who were reluctant to hear them for most of her professional life, which I came to understand was exactly true. She went through the orientation materials with me at a folding table, and she handed me a laminated card with feeding quantities and a sheet of contact protocols, and she said, "The radio in the cabin works on clear days. You'll be fine." She did not say it dismissively. She said it the way a person says something they have confirmed to be true, through repeated observation. The cabin sat on 20 acres of mixed timber at the end of a gravel road in the foothills, a working station that the program used as a halfway release point for animals that were rehabilitated enough to leave a clinical setting, but not yet reliable enough to go directly to the wild. While I was there, the patients were 7 in total. 2 red-tailed hawks in a flight enclosure on the east side of the cabin, one with a wing that had been pinned and was healing. 3 raccoon kits in a wire run behind the cabin, old enough to forage for themselves but still congregating at the water dish on schedule, like an appointment they kept out of habit. An opossum in a ventilated crate near the woodpile that had been hit by a car on Route 9 and was recovering from a fractured pelvis, though its disposition throughout suggested it found this more inconvenient than serious. And 1 large domestic rabbit that had been turned loose by its previous owners in the second week of September and had been found dehydrated and thin near the program's drop trap. His name on the intake form was listed as unknown, which I ignored. He was a rabbit of considerable size and calm temperament, and I started calling him Hector on the first afternoon, and he accepted this without visible objection. I arrived on a Monday afternoon in the last week of October, The drive up the gravel road took 12 minutes from the county highway, and I counted them, the way I still counted things out of habit from work, building a picture of a place through its tolerances before I trusted it. The cabin was small and practical, a single main room with a narrow sleeping loft, a propane stove, a wood stove for heat, and a porch that ran the full width of the front and looked out across a cleared apron of ground toward the tree line about 60 yards out. The timber there was a mix of Douglas fir and big-leaf maple and a few red alder, along what I guessed was a seasonal drainage to the north. The leaves on the maples were at peak colour, and they moved in the light the way things move when they have almost finished moving. It was that stage of October. I did the first feeding round in the last hour of daylight. The hawks ate on their own terms and ignored me. The raccoon kits argued briefly over the water dish and then forgot what they were arguing about. The opossum accepted its portion with the philosophical air it brought to everything. Hector sat in the middle of his enclosure and watched me fill his bowl with the particular attentiveness of an animal that has made a study of routine. It was while I was washing my hands at the cabin's small sink that I noticed Carol's apples. I had packed provisions for 4 days, and somewhere in the packing I had put in a bag of Fuji's without fully thinking about why, because Carol had kept a bowl of them on the counter every October since I could remember, and buying them in October was something my hands did before my mind caught up. There were 9 of them in the bag. I stood there with my hands drying on a dish towel, and I looked at those apples, and I did not know what to do next. What I did, eventually, was slice 2 of them and put the slices in the small enamel dish I had found on the shelf above the sink. The dish was white with a blue rim, the kind of thing that has been in a working cabin for 20 years and has no story attached to it. I carried it out and set it on the porch rail at the corner where the eave made a slight overhang. And then I went back inside and made supper and did not think carefully about why I had done it. Carol used to put food out for the deer at the edge of the yard. She had done it every autumn for as long as we were married, and the deer came most evenings and ate what she left, and she would watch from the kitchen window with a satisfaction that I always found slightly in excess of what the situation seemed to warrant. I had thought she was being sentimental. Standing on that porch in October with a dish of apple slices and no good explanation for my behaviour, I began to revise that opinion. If you are the kind of person who keeps watching this kind of story, I think you know what I mean when I say that some habits carry more weight than the person who started them understood. I went to bed that first night, having done nothing particularly notable, and woke to a morning that was ordinary in all measurable ways, and the day passed in its routines. I checked the hawk's enclosure and noted the healing wing was flexing more fully. I cleaned the raccoon run and replaced the water. I gave Hector a small piece of kale from my own supplies because he had looked at me for several seconds longer than a rabbit needs to look at a person, and I interpreted this as a request. The opossum ignored the kale entirely, which was its right. That evening I put fresh apple slices in the dish and set it on the rail again. I was not tracking anything. I was not expecting anything. I was simply doing a thing with my hands at the end of the day that made the end of the day easier to reach. On the morning of the second day, I went out to begin the feeding round at 7 in the morning and found the latch on the raccoon run standing open. Not broken, not forced. Open in the position it reaches only when you press it upward with deliberate pressure. The 3 kits were still inside, clustered near the water dish in the mild conspiracy that raccoons maintain with each other even at rest. They had not left. Nothing had come in, or if something had, it had left no mark I could find. I stood there for a while trying to account for it. The latch mechanism on that run required lifting the tongue up and then rotating it free of the keeper. A raccoon could conceivably manage it from the inside if it understood what it was attempting, and raccoons are not generally credited with an understanding of latches from the outside. A strong wind could, in theory, lift a loose latch, but this latch had no play in it, and the night had not been particularly windy. I had personally latched it the evening before, and I had checked it twice, which had become my habit after Donna told me at orientation that a latched enclosure and an unlatched enclosure look almost identical at a glance, and that a glance is not a check. I closed it and added a zip tie through the keeper as a secondary measure, and told myself a story about wind that I did not fully believe by the time I had finished telling it. That evening, Hector pressed himself against the section of wire nearest the porch and watched the tree line while I put the apple dish out. I noticed this only in the way you notice something that does not fit the pattern of what you have been seeing. A small departure from the known that registers before you have formed a complete thought about it. Hector was ordinarily a still animal, but his stillness that evening had a different quality. His ears were forward and not moving, and his weight was forward on his front feet, which is not the posture of an animal at rest. It is the posture of an animal attending to something. I looked at the tree line and saw nothing that I could name. Day 3 began cold, a sharper edge to it than the previous 2 mornings, and the frost on the porch boards was thick enough that it crunched under my boots where the shadow of the eave reached. I did the morning round and then went around the back of the cabin to check the drainage line on the grey water tank, because I had noticed the previous evening that it was running slow. The ground behind the cabin held soil that was somewhere between clay and loam, the kind that holds an impression reliably when it is wet, and it had rained briefly on the second night. The drainage line was clear when I checked it, blocked only by a clump of alder leaves that pulled free without effort. I replaced the screen cap and turned to go back around, and that is when I saw the prints. They ran along the soft ground behind the raccoon run in a loose line heading north toward the drainage and the timber beyond it. 2 prints, and then a third, each one roughly oval and larger than anything I had a ready frame for. My own boot is a size 11 and makes a print in that kind of soil that I know by sight. These were considerably wider and considerably longer, and they were pressed deeply enough that the soil had displaced cleanly at the edges rather than crumbling, which told me whatever made them had been moving slowly, carrying its weight forward deliberately rather than crossing the ground in any hurry. I crouched beside the middle print and measured it against my hand. I laid my hand flat inside it with my fingers spread, and there was still ground visible on all 4 sides. I did this twice. Hector was on the near side of his enclosure wire, close enough that I could have reached through and touched him. He was not alarmed. He was watching the same direction the prints went, toward the timber, and his ears were forward and his body was low and settled in the way a prey animal settles when it has assessed something and decided it is not a threat. I do not know enough about rabbit cognition to say what that means with any certainty. I know what it looked like. I went inside and stood at the kitchen window for a while, drinking coffee and looking at the tree line. I had been a lineman for 31 years. I had worked in terrain where black bear were common, and mountain lion were occasional, and elk moved through the utility corridors in the shoulder seasons. I knew what their tracks looked like in soft ground. I knew the general dimensions, the claw marks or absence of them, the stride pattern. The prints behind the cabin did not match anything in that inventory, and I had a thorough inventory. A bear in that substrate would have left claw marks forward of the toe impressions. These had none. The stride was not a bear stride. The impression was not a cougar impression, and in any case a cougar print would have been a fraction of the size. I told myself that depth perception is unreliable when you are crouching close to the ground and the light is still low and at an angle. I told myself that October soil in the foothills can be uneven in its consistency, and an impression can read larger than it is if the surrounding area has different compression characteristics. I told myself these things, and I went about the day's work and I checked every latch on every enclosure twice, and then once more. That evening, the third evening, I sliced the last of Carol's apples, which left me 4 for the rest of the stay. I put the slices in the dish and carried it to the porch rail and stood there for a moment in the blue dusk, watching the maples lose their colour as the light dropped. The temperature had fallen another 4 or 5 degrees from the previous evening, and I could see my breath. Somewhere in the timber to the north, an owl called once and did not repeat itself. I went inside. I read for an hour. I went to bed before 9, which was earlier than I had been going to bed for most of the 8 months since February. But the 4 days of early mornings and the cold air had begun to work on me in a way that felt more like restoration than fatigue, and I was not inclined to resist it. I had been asleep for perhaps 4 hours when I woke for reasons I could not immediately name. No sound I could identify, no movement in the cabin. The propane had held the room at a workable temperature, and Hector was quiet in the portable enclosure I had brought him into each night, because the October nights were too cold for a domestic rabbit unused to them. I lay still for several minutes and heard nothing beyond the ordinary sounds of a cabin in a light wind and the distant creak sound from the north drainage. I did not go back to sleep for a long time. I lay in the loft and looked at the ceiling and thought about Carol's apples, which is to say, I thought about Carol, which is the thing I had been carefully not doing since February, in the way that you do not look directly at a welding arc, because you know the damage it causes. She had put food out for the deer every autumn. She did it because she said the deer were out there in the cold, doing their best, and the least a person could do was acknowledge it. I had found this reasoning both sentimental and logically thin, and I had told her so with some regularity, and she had continued putting the food out with equal regularity, and I had watched her do it from the kitchen window and been privately glad that she did. I missed her with a physical weight that I had no outlet for. It sat in my chest like cordwood, stacked and waiting. I had not cried since the afternoon of the 14th of February. I had stood at the sink in our kitchen, and I had felt something beginning, and I had turned the cold water on fully, and I had bent my head, and I had stopped it. I am not sure, even now, whether that was strength or cowardice. I suspect it was both, in proportions I was not prepared to examine. I got up well before dawn and came downstairs and made coffee, and sat at the cabin's small table and watched the window lighten by degrees. I was not waiting for anything. I want to be clear about that. I was sitting with my coffee because I was awake and there was nowhere to go, not because I had any expectation of what the morning would bring. The light was at the stage where the world becomes visible, but has not yet become itself, that grey interval between dark and full day, when I noticed that the door I had pulled to the night before was standing open by about 3 inches. Not unlatched, the latch tongue was still in the keeper. The door had been pushed in against the latch and pulled back to this 3-inch gap from the outside, and the latch had not engaged on its return. A possibility if the door is drawn carefully back from the outside to the point where the tongue just clears the keeper and then held there. I am a person who built my understanding of the world on tolerances, and I noticed this immediately and stood up from the table. I went to the door and opened it fully and stepped out onto the porch in my boot socks, which I do not recommend in late October frost, but was not thinking clearly about. The creature was at the tree line. It was standing at the far edge of the cleared apron of ground where the grass gave way to the first timber, and it was facing the cabin. and in the early grey light it was visible enough that I understood its scale immediately. 8 feet was my first thought. Maybe a fraction more, the kind of height that does not register as an animal and does not register as a person, and therefore sits in some third category that the mind hesitates over. Dark across the shoulders and the back, and the posture was not crouched or gathered. It was still in the way something is still when it has made a decision to be still, weight forward and low, and the head turned slightly so that I understood it could see me and was allowing me to see that it could. I have been trying to describe that moment accurately for the weeks since it happened, and I keep arriving at the same inadequate sentence. I was not afraid. I know how that reads. I know that a man standing in his boot socks on a frost-covered porch in the dark morning looking at something of that scale should register fear, and I am prepared to accept that what I felt was something so far outside the categories I had for fear and for safety that my body did not know which register to put it in. What I can say with more confidence is that I did not move, and it did not move, and the morning held itself between us for a span of time I could not accurately measure. Then it moved, and what it did was this. It stepped forward from the tree line across the frost-pale grass with a deliberateness that seemed to carry its own weight, each step placed and finished before the next one began. It crossed perhaps half the distance to the porch, and then it stopped, and it went down to one knee, or the motion that served the same purpose, and it placed something on the ground in front of it. Then it straightened and stepped back 2 paces, and waited. And I understood, without being told in any language I recognize, that the placing was finished. I went down the porch steps in my boot socks without thinking about it. The frost on the grass soaked through immediately, and I felt the cold in my feet, but I was not thinking about my feet. I crossed the ground between us, and I looked at what it had placed there. It was a piece of cedar bark, split and smoothed, roughly the length of my forearm. There was a second piece beside it. The second piece was curved slightly and had been worked along its edges until they were no longer sharp, and it sat in the frost grass like something that had been thought about before it was placed. It sat beside the first piece, which I recognized. The piece I had found the previous evening beside the enamel dish on the porch rail when I stepped out to check on the hawks before bed, and had carried inside with me, running my thumb along its surface, trying to understand its surface, and then set on the windowsill above the sink. The piece on the windowsill was gone. I had not registered its absence in my early morning distraction. The creature had gone to it, through the 3-inch gap, and taken it back. I stood in the frost grass in my wet socks, holding that understanding. The dish on the porch rail held the apple slices I had put out the evening before. The creature had arranged the 2 pieces of cedar bark parallel to each other on the ground before me, one its own and one mine returned in the same careful arrangement as the slices in the dish. It had watched me put the dish out evening after evening, watched me place the slices carefully, watched me stand for a moment at the rail as if I were making an offering I could not fully name. And it had answered that gesture in the only material language it had available. I understood what Carol had meant about the deer. Something in my chest gave way. Not collapsed, not broke. Gave way is the right phrase, the way a fence gate gives way when you have been leaning on it without knowing you were leaning on it, and someone unfastens the latch. I stood in the wet grass and felt it happen, and I'm not going to describe it in any more detail than that, because I do not have more detail than that. I know what it felt like from the outside. It felt like 8 months of cordwood letting go at once. I was aware that I was crying, which surprised me. When I raised my head, the creature was at the tree line again, already at the margin of the timber, and it turned once, and I had the sense, though I cannot defend this sense, that it had waited for me to look up before it went. It stepped back into the fir and the maple, and the grey morning closed behind it without any drama at all. I stood there for a while, feet soaked, breath coming uneven, until I had more composure than the situation strictly required. Then I went up the porch steps and found Hector sitting in his portable enclosure near the door, his front feet square, his ears forward, his posture the same settled attending that I had seen at the enclosure wire on the second evening. He looked at me with the patient certainty of an animal that has been in possession of information you are only just now receiving. I went inside and changed my socks and put more wood in the stove. Around mid-morning, I raised Donna on the radio. The signal was clear, which it was not always. "Fisher cabin, go ahead," she said. "It's Wayne," I said. "I wanted to log something. One of the patients released itself overnight. The situation is stable. I wanted you to have it in the record." There was a pause. "Which patient?" she said. I thought about how to answer that and said, "The situation is stable. Everything else is where it should be." Another pause, shorter this time. "All right, I'll note it. You okay out there?" "Yes," I said. "I think so. Yes." I finished the rotation the following morning as scheduled. I fed the hawks and the raccoon kits and the opossum and Hector for the last time, and closed up the cabin and drove the 12 minutes down the gravel road to the county highway. The maples along the road had dropped more leaves overnight, and the ground under them was bright with it. That particular October brightness that comes right at the end. I drove home to Ridgewood, and I walked through my own house, and I stood in the kitchen for a while. The bowl on the counter that had held Carol's apples was still there, the way things stay in the places you put them because you cannot yet decide to move them. I stood at the counter and looked at it. Then I went to the store and bought a bag of Fuji's, and I put them in the bowl. I called my daughter that evening. Her name is Marie, and we had spoken twice since February, and both times it had been brief and careful in the way of people who are afraid of what they might say if they are not. She picked up on the third ring and I said, "I'm okay," which was both less and more than what I wanted to say. And she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I know, Dad," which was also less and more than what she wanted to say, and we talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular, which was everything in particular. I went back to the program in November. I have done 2 rotations since. Donna assigns me to the Foothills cabin when it is available, which it is not always, but often enough. I bring Fuji's when I go. The apple dish is still on the porch rail when I arrive. Someone keeps it there between rotations, or it stays on its own. I have not asked. I put fresh slices in it the first evening of each stay, and leave it where it is. I do not know what I saw in October. I want to be precise about that. I know its dimensions, and I know the shape of what it did, and I know the material evidence it left behind, and I know what that evidence meant when I understood it. I do not know what category it belongs to, and I have stopped looking for one that fits. There is no category in any inventory I have access to that would contain all of the facts as I observed them, and I have been patient enough with facts to know when to stop pressing them toward a conclusion they will not reach. Donna asked me once, about 6 weeks after the October rotation, whether I had any additional details to add to the log entry from the last day. We were at the extension office and she was doing end-of-season reviews. She had a particular way of asking questions that made clear she already had a framework for the answer and was giving you the courtesy of filling it in yourself. I thought about it. I said, "No. I think the log is complete." She looked at me for a moment over her reading glasses. "All right," she said, and made a small mark on her paper. I do not know what she thought she knew. I have not asked. There are things you carry alone not because they cannot be shared, but because the sharing changes the shape of them. And some things have a shape that is right as it is. On my most recent rotation, 3 weeks ago, I put the dish out on the first evening as I always do, and went inside and made supper and went to bed at a reasonable hour. In the morning, I came out to start the feeding round and found the dish tipped on its side on the porch rail, which can happen with any animal light enough to stand on a railing, and happens occasionally with the larger jays. The slices were not on the rail, and not on the porch boards and not on the ground below. Whatever had come in the night had taken them and left the dish behind. I set the dish right side up and stood there a moment in the October light, and Hector watched me from his enclosure with his ears forward and his weight settled, and I was not cold, or if I was, I did not notice it. I went inside and sliced 2 more apples and carried them out and filled the dish again.